Hi, and thank you all for joining us today. We are broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network and the UFO Paranormal Radio Network, 105.3 on the Gulf Coast and 107.7 FM in New Orleans. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And today we're super excited because we have Tobias Wayland with us, and I'll tell you all about him and what we're going to talk about soon. But again, welcome to Ethereal Encounters Unveiled, where you can discover your truth. Today, we're broadcasting on the United Public Radio Network and the UFO Paranormal Radio Network, which is 105.3 on the Gulf Coast and 107.7 FM in New Orleans, as you just heard. Please leave any comments, questions in the description of whatever social media platform you are watching, or obviously if you're listening, you can't, but please feel free to hop over to visit us on any social media platform where you can then leave your questions, comments, whatever you like for Tobias. So today we have a very interesting topic that we're going to be talking about, one that's intrigued me for quite some time. And the name of this podcast is called Mothman, Sightings and Investigations of the Iconic Flying Cryptid. That's actually the name of the book that we're going to be talking about. And this isn't just about cryptid lore. It feels like an active investigation into an ongoing phenomenon. And today, as I said, we're welcoming Tobias Wayland, and it's truly a privilege to be able to have him on the show with us. And his new book, which I just stated, Mothman, Sightings and Investigations of the Iconic Flying Cryptid. He also co-authored that with Richard Estep, I believe. And it's not just another retelling of the Point Pleasant legend. This book covers firsthand account witnesses, detailed investigations, and focuses on concentrations of sightings beyond Point Pleasant, specifically in the Chicago and Lake Michigan area. It also delves into the science of Mothman. And if you've never heard about that legend before, that cryptid, you're going to learn a lot about him today. So in essence, his book aims to offer us a comprehensive and updated examination of the Mothman phenomenon while broadening the scope beyond its most famous historical context into contemporary sightings and more analytical investigations into the nature and patterns. So let me bring Tobias on stage. Tobias, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So as I was telling you earlier, I read your book and it was a real page turner. Great. And we will have all the links in the description of this video to where folks can visit your website. That reminds me, let me get the banner running across so folks can see. Now, I linked it to singularfortean.com. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is my website. So I do write like occasional news articles and things regarding just whatever weird stuff happens to be going on. Well, especially regarding the cases that I personally investigate. So anybody who wants to keep up with whatever weird stuff I'm doing, that's a great way to do it, or following me on social media, either way.
Yes, and of course we'll have all those links to your Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and so on. So let's dig into this. And of course, I'm going to ask you a kind of common question I'm sure you get, but what sparked, or ignited your personal interest in Mothman? And more specifically, like what drove you and Richard to start digging into these overlooked concentrations of sightings, particularly in the Chicago and Lake Michigan area?
Sure. So, I actually live just 20 miles north of the Wisconsin-Illinois border. And so I'm relatively close to where many of these Midwest sightings have taken place. And, honestly, as far as my introduction to this investigation, it was almost purely on accident, really. I was covering weird news for my website, basically. And I had seen in an article going around about these three winged creature sightings out of Chicago that had come through the Mutual UFO Network case management system. And so MUFON had sort of written a short article about all three of these sightings. And I thought, well, that's an interesting story. I should pick that up and write about it for my website too. I think people that read that would be very interested. And so I did, and there wasn't a lot of information about them, frankly. I came to find out later by speaking with Sam Moranto, who was the state director for MUFON in Illinois, that they really weren't able to investigate those sightings very well, and it wasn't necessarily their fault at all. They just had very limited contact with those witnesses.
Mm.
You know, having seen that one article, writing my short article about it, I honestly thought that was going to be it. I didn't think we were going to get much more. It just would have been one of those weird one-off sort of incidents that you forget about in a couple of months. But boy, that is not what happened. Instead, I started seeing more and more of these sighting reports, and they weren't coming into MUFON. They were coming into Lon Strickler over at Phantoms and Monsters and Manuel Navarrete over at UFO Clearinghouse. And so I reached out to both of those guys independently and interviewed them both separately. And because I was really interested in what the deal was. I mean, there's so many weird winged humanoid sightings coming in an area in which I live. Of course, I'm going to be interested in that. And they were both very forthcoming in terms of sharing information, very willing to be interviewed, very willing to talk about what was happening. Of course, they didn't want to share witness info, which I completely understood. I don't do that either without permission. And, it wasn't too long after that, just through covering those sightings, that people started to reach out to me directly and report their sightings. And it just made sense to sort of coordinate all of our efforts and work together to begin in investigating those sightings, because they were really coming in by like the dozen.
Wow.
There have been so many at this point. Yeah, it was unbelievable, really. And so that more or less sort of catches us up as to how I was introduced to this. It was, again, like purely on accident. I just happened to be interested in the paranormal and writing about a variety of weird subjects. And I live in the area where all of this weird stuff was happening. So it was easy for me to be able to go and visit witnesses and investigate sighting areas and all of that stuff. So it was a matter of convenience. As far as Richard is concerned, we had met a few years ago, just being at the same paranormal conferences, and we hit it off, and we were friends. And so he was approached by Llewellyn because they were interested in this subject. They normally will cover a lot of like witchcraft and occult kind of subjects, but they've been getting more and more into sort of weird paranormal stuff, and they were interested in Mothman, and they mentioned that to Richard, and Richard was like, "Well, turns out I know a guy who would be really qualified to write this book," and so he reached out to me and asked if I would want to do it with him, and I said, "Of course, it's great to be able to work with your friends whenever you can," and there you go. I mean, that's more or less how we ended up writing this book.
Awesome. So have you always had an interest in cryptids? Like I heard you say earlier that you for your own website, you do some research. So this kind of just tripped upon you, which is so cool.
Yeah. I've always had a broad interest in everything strange, and that's because for really the entirety of my life, as far back as I can remember, I've had paranormal experiences. And as a result, I was driven to try to learn more about these subjects. Like I'm old enough that when I was a kid, what I had to do is I rode my bike down to the local library, and I found books in like the speculative nonfiction or occult section. And, it would be like a lot of these authors behind me. I was a lot of John Keel and Whitley Strieber and Rosemary Ellen Guiley and Brad Steiger and just people like that. And they were writing about folks who had experiences similar to mine. And I took a lot of comfort in that, because when I was a kid, I couldn't really tell anybody about this,
Yeah.
because it's not like I had solid evidence, like the things that were happening to me. Was a lot of nighttime visitation experiences, shadow people, and that kind of stuff. And you tell your parents, and at that age, they just assume that it's childhood imagination. But the thing about it is, it never stopped. It didn't stay in my childhood. It has continued on through, periodically throughout my life. And so
That's
really given
fascinating.
me, yeah.
What was it mostly like spiritual visitations, like from spirits, or was it more UFO related? Like, what were the visitations like for you?
Sure. And that's a really interesting question. And it's one that I've asked myself, because I don't have a very good answer, frankly. Because something that I have come to learn through investigating the wide variety of phenomena that I have at this point is that there are so many commonalities between seemingly disparate aspects of the paranormal that it's difficult for me to categorize one as spiritual and one as like temporal. I just can't. And so I think if you are interested in like alien abduction and UFOs, and you look at my experiences, viewing them through that lens, you might say, oh, well, that guy was an abductee. If you are interested in the more spiritual aspects of the paranormal, and you view my experiences through that lens, you might say, oh, well, this guy had an attachment, or his house was haunted, or something similar. But who's to say, really? I can say definitively that I don't have an explanation for the experiences. That is to say, I'm not convinced that there is any kind of prosaic explanation that could easily identify them. And beyond that, they do seem to have aspects that are both immaterial and material. That is to say, there's this sort of ephemeral quality to them, but there's also this very physical quality, because I have been touched, and I felt that. That's not something that you would expect from some kind of phenomenon without any substance.
Yeah. When was the last experience you had, like a paranormal experience?
Sure. The last one that I recall would have been a couple of years ago. This was when my wife and I, so my wife and I had gone to bed quite normally. And I woke up that night, and it took me a second to realize why, but my wife was talking in her sleep. And that's not that uncommon, frankly. Like, she talks in her sleep. So I didn't think it was any big deal. And I, at first, I like looked over to make sure everything was okay. Like, she wasn't actually awake, and needed something. But no, she was asleep. She was just talking in her sleep. And so I was like, oh, okay, well, that's fine then. And I roll over to go back to sleep. And I rolled back over onto my stomach, and my head was sort of facing to my left. And when I did, I remember seeing this, and I'm fully awake, right? In that moment, I had not gone back to sleep. I hadn't even closed my eyes, nothing. I see this hand start to come like into my vision, and it looked like black and dark and kind of like crusty or scaly. And simultaneously, while that is happening, I feel these other hands. And this is something I felt many, many times before. I feel these other hands, and it feels like they are digging underneath me, as though they're going to lift me up. And I panicked, of course, because I think a lot of people would in that situation, even though at that time in my life, but by now I'm fairly used to it, but still there's this like visceral immediate reaction when something like that happens. And so I start frantically slapping, like trying to hit these hands. And I can feel, when I do that, I can feel me, like my hand connecting with them and hitting them.
Oh, my word.
And when I do that, the hand that I can see in front of my face recedes just right back where it came from, and then gone. You know, these other hands have seemingly vanished, just disappeared. Yeah, I mean, I haven't had anything in that vein happen since. You know, I do experience dream visitations and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. Those are pretty personal, though. You know, so.
Wow. And you've had these hands before, where you felt like you were being lifted.
Yes.
You've
Yeah.
experienced that before.
Absolutely. I mean, that was one of the earliest memories I have as a little kid. I mean, we're talking 2, 3, 4, years old before you can even fully form like long-term memories, right? You know, where I would remember being terrified to go to bed because I knew when I did something was going to happen to me. And it was always something like that, where I would wake up feeling something digging painfully into my ribs, or feeling like hands were lifting me up, or I would have the covers over my head or something, and I would see hands pressing in from the
Mm.
outside. And so, yeah, I mean, to have that continue on into, my 30s and 40s, at this point, it's difficult to just write that off as childhood daydreams.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, that sounds terrifying. But do you have any accounts of missing time from that, or like you would just fall back to sleep?
Yeah, normally I would, after some time, like there were plenty of nights, especially when I was younger, where I never, it took a long time for me to get back to sleep. I don't know about missing time, because when those kinds of experiences would happen, I wouldn't really be in a position to kind of note what time it was, right? Because if you're being visited at nighttime, especially if you're in bed or something similar, then you don't really know what time it is. And
Yeah.
so I've never had an experience of missing time. Like, say, people will report if they see a light when they're out driving. Like, nothing like
Hmm.
that has ever
Nothing
happened to
like
me.
that.
Yeah, so if something happened to me while I was asleep or unconscious, then I couldn't
Yeah,
know
you
about
wouldn't
it,
know.
right?
So let's talk about Mothman a little bit. For folks that don't know the legend, I mean, I've obviously heard of and read about this legend, this cryptid, so to speak, right? Tell folks, like, about the origins of Mothman. Maybe we could get started there, just in case folks never heard of him, or, and I say him, it could be a her too. We don't know.
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, and that's totally fair. Mothman is fairly esoteric, like, even for this space. A lot of people who are interested in other paranormal subjects haven't necessarily heard of that, and I think that's totally fine. That's part of the impetus behind writing this book. So for anybody not familiar with Mothman, I think the world more or less was introduced to this particular cryptid back in 1966. And that was the beginning of a series of sightings around Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Although
Hmm.
many of the sightings actually took place across the river in Ohio. So it wasn't just West Virginia, it was really all along that Ohio River Valley. So, like, West Virginia and Ohio both had a pretty good share of sightings at that time. And they largely lasted, or at least the most attention, I think, was paid to them between 1966 and the end of 1967. Although, I mean, sightings are still sporadically reported today, even. So I don't think that the phenomenon ever really ended there. But what people were reporting, and still are, there and of course throughout the United States at this point, was a large, 6 to 7 foot tall,
Hmm.
humanoid being with these enormous wings that were normally reported to be around 12 or 15 feet total in wingspan. And
Hmm.
perhaps the most defining feature of this thing, whatever it was, were its glowing red eyes. Like, people really would describe the impact that these eyes had. And I've spoken to plenty of witnesses myself, since we've been investigating sightings in this area. And And there are all kinds of parapsychological effects, I think, that are associated with those eyes, because people will describe this feeling of terror. I've had witnesses describe feeling a sort of sense of evil. Some people will feel hypnotized, or as though this being is sort of staring through them into their soul. And so if there's one thing, like most people can seem to agree on with Mothman, it is this terrifying presence, and often, but not always, often these really striking glowing red eyes.
Now, I might be getting my cryptids mixed up, but wasn't Mothman always associated with, before a sighting, that something terrible would happen? Wasn't there a bridge incident where he was spotted? Tell us about that.
Sure. So now there's a little bit of controversy surrounding that, because it's never really been proven that Mothman had anything to do with this bridge collapse. But you're absolutely right. The Silver Bridge did very tragically collapse in December of 1967, and some 4 dozen people passed away as a result of that bridge collapse. It was a huge deal. I mean, it was nationwide news. It changed how we look at bridge infrastructure across the entire country, because nobody wanted that to ever happen again, because it was absolutely terrible. And it is interesting that leading up to that collapse was this spate of Mothman sightings. Now, that has led people to speculate that there is some kind of connection there, and maybe there is. I'm not personally convinced, but I understand why people make that connection. I'll tell you this, from going out to Point Pleasant and just talking to just regular townsfolk who live out there, some of the older folks who were around back then. Nobody, or I should say, the vast majority of the people who lived in that area really didn't make that connection. They didn't think that Mothman had anything to do with that Silver Bridge collapse. I mean, there was an entire investigation, and it was found to be this faulty I-beam, which led to legislation and this whole changing of how we approach bridge infrastructure. So most people weren't making that connection until Gray Barker wrote his book, The Silver Bridge, and then a few years later, the much more popular Mothman Prophecies by John Keel came out. And by then, it was kind of solidified in the lore. And I think that's carried forward to today.
Yeah. Do you think these cryptids are like tulpas, where, like the tall man story about that cryptid that's like supposedly 15 feet tall or something? It just seems like a lot of these type of cryptids and creatures come to life when they're talked about so much. So I'm wondering, like, have you heard of anything like that where we could shape them into reality just by creating them?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think that there is some let's say psychic element to these sightings. Whether or not they are tulpas or egregores or some other kind of thought form is arguable, but they do seem to utilize human consciousness, if for nothing else, as a medium of communication, right? So I think that could explain quite a few aspects of this phenomenon, right? Because if you look at Mothman specifically, physically, Mothman doesn't make any sense. I mean, something my size or even bigger with only a 12 to 15 foot wingspan, that should not be able to fly. And yet here we are.
Yeah.
People are reporting this thing as flying around. And so I think that it's entirely possible that what we're dealing with is some entity or phenomenon that is capable of appearing in probably a variety of forms, or could be a manifestation or its appearance could be a manifestation of our own expectations or our own subconscious influence. For instance, one of the one of the defining traits of these sightings is fear, and they don't really make a lot of sense a lot of the time outside of that specific quality, right? Like, it doesn't make sense for Mothman to just be hanging out for no reason, flying around doing whatever. But if you view it through that lens, like if you look at it from the perspective of fear being the point, then all of a sudden they make a lot of sense. Because one thing this phenomenon does really, really well is scare people.
Yeah.
And so if you're dealing with something that wants to do that, and it's capable of reading your innermost thoughts, or delving deep into the human psyche, and plucking out pieces of that it knows will terrify you, then maybe that's why it appears the way that it does. And whether that or not, that I don't know that makes it a thought form, but it seems to interact on that level.
I mean, they have these creatures haven't really hurt anyone, right? Or they're not associated with any deaths, correct?
Yes. Yeah. As far as I know, I have never spoken to anyone who has actually been physically harmed. And there have certainly been situations where people could be physically harmed. I spoke to a woman who wanted to report her father sighting from back in the 1970s. And this took place in Waukegan, Illinois, which is like a northern suburb of Chicago. And her dad's story was that basically he was out late one night helping one of his friends jumpstart his car, and he suddenly became very terrified, just out of nowhere. And he turns around and he sees this thing up on top of this building, this winged creature with these red eyes, and the thing swoops down on him. And he and his buddy decide that they're gonna beat feet, like they're just getting out of there, which makes sense. And they jump into the working car, and they take off. But as they did, he said this thing kept attacking his car, and I have to believe that if this thing really wanted to hurt him, he'd be hurt. What that sounds like to me is that it wanted to scare him, and it definitely did.
Yeah, I've seen photographs of supposed claw marks on cars and, fingerprints and things like that. But who knows? I mean, you don't know what to believe to be fabrication, or, you want to trust people and believe what they say. It kind of reminds me of the Jersey Devil stories a little bit, right?
Sure.
Kind of like a winged cryptid.
Yeah.
Weird.
Well, I mean, that the Jersey Devil is another interesting case, because we kind of know where the folklore aspect of the Jersey Devil came from. Like that part of it is very well documented. But at the same time, people in all earnestness are still coming forward with these experiences that they can't explain, right? So is it possible that, there is folklore being applied to explain this otherwise unexplained phenomenon? Sure, totally. I don't think that like Mrs. Leeds actually gave birth to the devil's baby, and that's why, the Jersey Devil is flying around. But if people are seeing something that they can't explain, it's not unusual to concoct some kind of story like that to actually explain it. So who knows?
Yeah, there's even I remember seeing pictures of the house that the baby was born in. It, people go visit it today, and it's like this big folklore thing in Jersey. But it's similar in terms of descriptions of what this cryptid looks like, right? Winged, glowing eyes, that kind of thing.
Yeah, basically. It is very similar. Like, well, you get some of the popular depictions, and it's kind of, as far as the Jersey Devil is concerned, it's sort of this chimeric character where it's got like a horse head, but then like bird feet and wings and breathes fire or something. But a lot of that is probably just tacked on to make the story more interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Well, out of all the stories people you've interviewed, what's the most compelling one that made you like, was there one, more than one, where you were like, wow, this really sounds like the truth?
There have been quite a few, honestly. I try not to publish stories where I am not at least convinced that the person telling it is authentically relating their experience. So or if there is something problematic about a sighting, or how it was reported, or anything, I always make sure to actually include that. If I feel like it's important enough to share, then I'll make sure people know, like, maybe take that one with a grain of salt. But there are so many. Honestly, I'll tell you, it's quite an experience to actually be face to face with another human being, another adult who is visibly, shaking, sweating, clearly terrified, telling you about this experience they've had. I remember there was one down in Illinois. This was in Woodstock. I believe it was 2018. And this witness, who chose to remain anonymous, and I'll keep him that way,
Mm-hmm.
had reached out because he had seen something while he was driving home one night. He was driving past the Dewfield Pond Conservation Area in lovely Woodstock, Illinois. And what's interesting about this sighting is because, like so many others, he was just out running an errand. He wasn't doing
Yeah.
anything special. He had gone down to Walgreens to pick up some milk, and that was it.
Mm.
And It was February, and it was probably 8 p.m. So it was fully dark out by then. And he had his headlights on. And as he was going, he's coming up to the entrance to this conservation area, and he sees this thing sort of walk out in front of him. And he described it as this large humanoid that appeared to maybe be covered in like dark fur or something. And that's fairly common too. And he said it had these huge wings, and it just walked out into the road. He saw it for a good few seconds, while it was
Wow.
in his headlights. And then it crossed the street and went like between this house and some trees, and
Yeah.
then was just gone. And behind that house is the McHenry County Fairgrounds. And so it would have just gone into where nobody was going to see it at that
Mm-hmm.
point. And what was interesting about that to me is it took a little convincing, but he was willing to let me come down there and talk to him and talk to his wife. And they took us out to the sighting area and showed us around and everything. And these people, I got to tell you, they had nothing to gain from this, other than, I think, the sort of usual cathartic release and validation, frankly, that people have
Yeah.
from speaking to someone who will actually take them seriously. Because these were people, they had professional careers in town. They were terrified about their
Sure.
story getting out because of how it might actually affect their life. And like I said, it's one thing to read an article or a book that I've written about that, but when you're at somebody's home and they're telling you about this experience that they've had, this life-altering experience, and they don't want anything other than for somebody to finally listen to them without making fun of them or laughing at them or something, it's powerful,
Oh,
and
sure.
I've had a lot of those.
Yeah.
So.
Has anyone reported these? Well, you mentioned MUFON, and they're not really looking into too many of these types of stories, right? I'm sure they have enough on their plate with the UFO stuff, but
Right.
did they? Yeah, did they get reported to the police ever? Does anybody ever actually file a police report or call somebody somewhere?
Sure. It's not very common for people to call the police anymore. I feel like that kind of ended a few decades ago, but it still happens sometimes. So really, the other interesting thing that happened in that area of Woodstock, Illinois, is there was a 911 call made. So
Mm.
sometime after that witness that I just described had his experience, another witness was at the grocery store. I believe there's a grocery store over there, and there's this tall chain link fence at the edge of the parking lot. He said he was out there. It was real late, maybe 2 a.m. or something, and he saw this thing like this other guy had described. He was out in the McHenry County Fairgrounds, and at first you get a report like that, and you're like, okay, sure, yeah, you did, buddy. This other guy just reported it. But one thing that makes this much more compelling is that he called 911, and I reached out to the Woodstock police, and I believe they directed me to the McHenry County Sheriff's Department. It was either that or the other way around. But regardless, they were very, very helpful. And, I submitted a FOIA request to them, and they sent me the incident detail report for that 911 call, because a deputy did go out there and respond to it and talk to the guy. And he wasn't arrested or anything for making fake 911 calls. So I have to believe that it was, taken seriously enough, maybe not for the deputy to fully believe that he saw Mothman, but at least, he didn't get in any trouble for it. So he might have, at the very least, he didn't have enough evidence of it being a prank call or anything to do anything about it. And that is enough to make it interesting to me when you consider the other sightings in that area.
Yeah. Now, you've never seen Mothman, like you've never witnessed that type of cryptid. Okay. Now, in your book, you have like a whole extraterrestrial, ultra terrestrial theory, right? That you talk about in the book.
Yeah. So that comes from John Keel, and
right.
Yeah, even prior to the Mothman prophecies, he was writing Operation Trojan Horse. I was struggling to think of that name. I don't know why. I've read the book like 5 times, but he was writing stuff like Operation Trojan Horse. And of course, after the Mothman prophecies came out, he followed it up with the Eighth Tower, which really expanded on some of the ideas that he had mentioned in there, including stuff like ultra terrestrials. And so the idea behind that from Keel was that all of these seemingly disparate paranormal phenomena, from ghosts to UFOs to, saucer occupants to cryptids, whatever, have this common source. And he called them ultra terrestrials, because it's not that they were from somewhere else. They're from here. They just exist in a form where we can't easily view them. And so every interaction is kind of on their terms, right? They can appear as anything they want. They can appear wherever or whenever they want. And that was essentially, his idea to explain all of the weird commonalities and things that exist, across these various phenomena. I don't know that I believe 100% that like all ghosts are the same or come from the same source as like all UFOs or whatever, because I've had dream visitations from departed loved ones, and I know other people who have had that kind of communication. And I'm sorry, I just don't think that was an alien or an ultra terrestrial or whatever. But it is interesting, and it's part of the Mothman thing. Like, you have to mention it.
Yes, yeah, definitely. What was the name of his book? Was it Low, or who authored that book?
So that's Charles Fort.
Right.
And,
okay.
Charles Fort is Charles Fort is the reason that we have John Keel's paranormal philosophy. Because Charles Fort, for anybody who isn't familiar, was an early 20th century collector of weird news stories. So he would basically collect all of these weird news stories from like newspapers and scientific journal clippings and all of this stuff. And he would collect them all together and write about them. And he published, I think 3 or 4 books. So you had like Book of the Damned, Low, Wild Talents. He wrote all of these different books. And he didn't specialize in any one area. He really, I think, is largely responsible for sort of beginning that idea of some kind of weird hidden connection between phenomena, because that's something that he wrote about extensively, and so that's really like Keel is the natural evolution, I think, from Charles Fort, which is why we have that term Fortean. That comes from Charles Fort and sort of the philosophical, I think, approach to the paranormal that includes looking at it holistically instead of trying to separate everything and put it all in its own little box. And so, yeah, I think John Keel is sort of the natural evolution of that Fortean philosophy, and that his ultra-terrestrial hypothesis sort of arises quite naturally out of what the kind of stuff Fort was talking about.
I'm gonna read both of those authors' books because it really sparked an interest in me. I mean, I kind of like the premise of it, and I like how who talked about flaps or this flap window area? Was that Keel?
That was Keel, yeah. And so he had this idea that there were specific geographic areas that would attract high strangeness for whatever reason, and they had these sort of like ephemeral windows, that would open, and then you would get a huge like influx and confluence of various phenomena, and then the window closes, and it's just done at that point.
I really like that paragraph in your book where you describe that. I mean, I know you said you don't fully believe that it explains all high strangeness situations, but I do like the principle of it, that flaps occur within these windows, because it does seem to be like all of a sudden you, like with this book, there was just an influx of these sightings, and it almost seemed like maybe there was a flap that was opened where these entities, creatures, whatever you want to call them, come into our dimension. Like maybe it has to do with multi-dimension access or portals. Like what's your thought on that whole thing?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you the reason. Now, I want to preface this by saying that Keel's work is important, and I think how discovery does and should work is by building off of the important work committed by people before you. And so, in pushing back at all against Keel's work, I'm not trying to invalidate it or him as a researcher or anything like that. I just think that's like the sort of natural process. Hopefully someday somebody does that with my work, right? Mm-hmm. And so in terms of, like his hypotheses regarding window areas and flaps and stuff, it is interesting because you do see exactly what he's talking about, because that stuff does happen where you'll get a bunch of reports within a relatively small geographic area, mm-hmm. and they all seem to come very rapid fire, and it's just very strange. Now, in terms of why that happens, that becomes a little more difficult, because the one thing I will say is that it never ends. It might taper off and they might come slower, but it never actually ends. That window, it never closes fully. And at this point, I think it's bigger than people think too, because I've received reports from all over. I did Unsolved Mysteries last year, and after that aired, I started getting reports from all over the entire world, and they're consistent. Yeah, I mean, and there are these winged humanoid reports, and they're consistent with what people have been reporting here for decades, right? And even before then, I was getting reports like coast to coast here in, as far south as Texas and Mexico, and as far north as up into Canada, of people reporting these Mothman winged humanoid sightings. And so while that's happening, it's difficult to reconcile that with a very strict interpretation of, high strangeness window areas and flaps and things, because a very strict interpretation of those wouldn't or shouldn't allow for what I've been receiving. And yet here we are, these things are happening anyway. And so my sort of explanation for why we get a lot of reports out of, a relatively small area very quickly, it often, I think, has more to do with popularity and population density than it necessarily does with the frequency of sightings. So using Chicago as an example, it's a huge city.
Yes.
And obviously, when people see any kind of report of something strange, if they've had that kind of experience themselves, they're much more likely to come forward with it. Or if they are interested in this kind of stuff, or, maybe even prone to, fantasy in some way, then they might, after seeing that themselves, become biased to interpret things as that phenomenon. And I think we saw some of that in Chicago, which is why so many reports seem to come so quickly, because there are compelling cases, and I am not trying to explain everything away. But I think we have to do our due diligence and try to understand the cases that do have a prosaic explanation, because by doing so, then we better define the cases that don't, and that really ends up validating the actually truly anomalous experiences people have. And so I'm relatively confident in saying that about half of the Chicago sightings were very likely to be misidentified large birds. And it's interesting. It's true. And it's interesting when you look at those sightings too, is that they're so different from the actual paranormal ones. Like, they're so different. They take place during the day often, and the person will see this thing flying and it's kind of far away, and they don't have any of the weird paranormal stuff that like other people will describe, like the fear or any other weird stuff, because a lot of people will have a Mothman sighting and they might see a UFO, or their house might be inexplicably haunted afterwards or something. And so when you take all of those away, and you boil it down to just the truly, truly interesting sightings, the ones that I think have a very good likelihood of actually being something weird, it's a much more manageable number. And it's not, I think, that different than what maybe is happening all over the place. And we just don't hear about it because the people who live there haven't been exposed to this phenomenon. And they assume that nobody else has ever seen anything like that. They don't want to come forward because, they don't want people to make fun of them.
It's so hard to, I think as a researcher, it would be so hard to muddle through all of this data and know what's a big vulture that they're seeing with 20-foot wingspan or something. But I don't know, that's why that flaps theory made sense to me, because even with UFOs, there does seem to be, like, look at the drone thing that happened in Jersey. We had this window where there were just drone sightings every 5 minutes. I mean, we had them here in Pennsylvania too. I could literally walk to New Jersey from where I live. I'm so close to the border. So, and then all of a sudden that flap seems to close. And then, every now and then you get them. And that's why that kind of resonated with me, because even though you're saying there are reports all over the world, maybe these reports, half of them or whatever percentage you just mentioned, to be real. I don't know. It just made sense to me, like a dimensional portal thing. I mean, especially go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah. I was just going to say, I mean, it's interesting, to mention like that multi-dimensionality, because I think when you look at the actual qualities of this phenomenon, it would be difficult to rule something like that out. Mm-hmm. And so I definitely don't want to make it seem as though I am rejecting that idea. Certainly
it's
not,
just a possibility, right? It's just you're putting it out
definitely.
there. Yeah, I like that. And it's funny because there's so many paranormal shows on too about portals, for whether it's demonic or angelic. I mean, it's just, the theories are just everywhere when it comes to portals and how these entities access this dimension. So portals kind of make sense to me. And then if you talk to a lot of psychics too, they're very much into the portal theory, where they're entering our dimension through these portals. But I don't know. You don't think that's true with Mothman? Where would it live? Like, where does it reside?
Well,
if it's not from another
exactly
dimension.
Well, I think that there is some aspect of like of extra dimensionality to this being. I think
Mhm.
that's a very likely explanation in terms of potential paranormal explanations
Yes,
for these sightings. I think that almost has to be the case,
sure.
because when you look at what this thing seems to be, it, like I said, it doesn't make any sense as a biologic organism, at least not as we understand them, because you're right, like there's no signs of predation where this thing
Mhm.
lives. So you have to ask yourself, what does it eat? And if it's being seen by people in these relatively populated areas, there's no way that like a breeding population of something that size, especially something that flies, could
Yeah.
live in those areas and not be discovered.
Mhm.
And then you add to that, there are plenty of witnesses who have described this thing just suddenly showing up or suddenly disappearing, sometimes vanishing while they're watching it. So, yeah, I think you absolutely have to be willing to entertain the idea that
Yeah.
this being exists in dimensions to which
Yeah.
we are not privy, or at the very least our physical beings aren't privy. And it's possible that our consciousness is, because if you think of the idea of our consciousness existing in more than the three dimensions of our physical bodies,
Yes.
then all of a sudden so much more of this makes more sense, and how we would be able to see it, how it would communicate with us, how it could appear as all of these different things. So yeah, no, it's
Yeah, I
interesting
mean,
stuff. You have to think
yeah,
about
it
it.
really is. It really is. I'm so intrigued by it. And especially, when you think about why it is that some humans are privy to these types of experiences and some aren't. And then when you look at things like frequency, vibration, energy, I can't help but wonder, maybe the people that are having these experiences are just vibrating on this perfect frequency that allows them access to this experience.
Sure, that's it's interesting that you mentioned that, because one of the things that I've seen fairly consistently is the possibility that something like altered states might have something to do with these sightings. I mentioned
Mhm.
that guy before down in Woodstock. His case was very normal. Now, what people don't understand is that we cycle through altered states of consciousness all day, every day.
Yeah,
It's
that's
everything
correct.
from dreaming to waking
Yeah.
up to falling asleep to daydreaming to meditation,
Oh,
all
yeah.
of these different altered states, right? And so when you're out driving or something, it's very easy to slip into something like
Yes.
highway hypnosis.
Yes, we all
And
do.
yeah, and what I have seen is the number of people who experience this kind of stuff when they're in a situation that would easily lend itself to that kind of altered state is very,
Mhm.
very high. And so I
Yeah.
do think that there's something to that. It could be that your state of mind is very important when it comes to experiencing paranormal things.
Yeah. And I think it's so different when you look at Bigfoot sightings. I don't necessarily think that's the case. I mean, there's so much more evidence for Bigfoot. We've seen huts that he's built, snap trees. We've heard recordings of the howlings. I mean, the evidence is much. There's a preponderance of evidence when it comes to, I think, when it comes to
Hmm.
Bigfoot as opposed to Mothman. And I think that's what makes Mothman so intriguing, and it's this anomaly. Like, people are seeing it, right? There are so many sightings, but yet it's so elusive. There's no video of it, correct? Has anybody captured pictures, images, video, anything?
Nothing credible, frankly. We have received photographs. They've all been explainable as
Yeah,
something
they've been
else.
crappy quality
So
and stuff. Yeah.
yeah, well, and honestly, part of how I was really able to lock in on that profile of misidentified bird sightings is because we received video evidence from somebody who really
Oh,
thought, like he really thought he had seen something strange, But in reviewing that evidence, you know, we were able to capture some good stills from the video he got, and it was a bird. It just was.
Bird. Wow,
So,
must have been a big bird.
you know, it was. It, like, based
Yeah,
on its silhouette, it could have been, you know, like a great blue heron or something
sure.
similar,
Yeah,
which
they're
they are
huge.
enormous.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, they're huge. Yeah. It's just interesting. And again, when you kind of benchmark it to Bigfoot, there's so many videos and images of Bigfoot that are really like legit. And the footprints that we capture. I mean, have there been any? Well, this is a flying cryptid, right? But
Right.
people are seeing it walk. So after it walks, are there any footprints or anything?
Interestingly enough, you know, I've only ever seen one. So in that Woodstock report that I mentioned earlier, when you know, I was able to get down there with my wife Emily pretty soon after this sighting had occurred, and they took us out, you know, like I said, to the sighting area. And at that time, it was, you know, it was late February, early March, and there was still snow on the ground, and there was a lot of ice in this area. And when they
Mhm.
were showing us where this thing would have come out of as it left the conservation area and walked across the road there, um, we found this anomalous footprint, and it looked like a human or humanoid footprint. You could
Mhm.
see the individual digits. You know, it seemed to have 5 toes, but it was big. You know, it was much longer and bigger than you would expect a normal human footprint to be. I mean, even if you, for whatever reason, could could believe that somebody was walking around barefoot in the snow and ice, you know, in northern Illinois, it was still a weirdly big footprint. Um, so that was the only one that I've ever seen, and it's the only one that I've even heard of. There just isn't the kind of physical evidence associated with this phenomenon that you see with something
Yeah.
like Bigfoot, because you're absolutely right. Like, there's much more evidence in favor of Bigfoot as an undiscovered animal species than there is for, well, almost any other cryptid, but especially Mothman.
Now you don't have. I got the PDF version of your book, but you don't have an image of this footprint in the printed version, do you? Are there any images in there that you shared? No.
Not in the new book. Anybody interested in that, who wants to go back and pick up the Lake Michigan Mothman, High Strangeness in the Midwest? Now,
Hmm.
I've got all kinds of images in there. So if you do want to see
Mm.
that footprint, it's in that book.
Oh, okay. You could send us the link to that, and I'll make sure I
Sure.
I add it so folks can check it out. So, are there any other like discernible patterns of behavior for Mothman? Like, it does it interact ever aside from some hostility? Like, has anybody reported? Because I remember hearing stories a long time ago about people seeing Mothman and it would like follow their car and kind of be this threatening winged thing hovering and kind of like racing with their vehicle, always aggressive, you know, always, like you said, trying to scare them. But have there been any other cases of interaction or something discernibly different from hostility that you've encountered?
I'm not familiar with any, honestly. It's been pretty consistent. The closest thing that would come to what you're describing would be people who just didn't interact with it much at all, honestly.
Mm.
But yeah, generally speaking, the closer in proximity that the witness is to Mothman, the likelier they are to be terrified, and like the
Yeah.
higher that level of terror is likely to be.
Yeah.
So
So for somebody to write a book about something, you have to really be like obsessed with it, so to speak, because it's taking, you know, almost years. But how many years did it take you to do this research? And it had to be a few, right?
sure. Well, I mean, I started investigating these sightings in the Midwest in the spring of 2017. And so by the time we started on this book, I mean, I was 7 years into this, you know. and I had already written 3 other books. I mean, only one of them was about, those Mothman sightings. But so yeah, I mean, it really, like, there are years and years of
Yeah.
experience in this work. As far as like Richard and my work into it, we still invested a significant amount of time going out to places like
Hmm.
Point Pleasant and Van Meter, Iowa, and of course down into Illinois and stuff, and all of these other places associated with sightings. So, I mean, this book itself took us over a year just to
Yeah, of
research and write.
course.
So,
Of course. And then there's finances involved. You have to pay for your, accommodations and travel. It's something that people like shouldn't just take willy-nilly. I'd like, if somebody writes a book about something, they're dead serious about they put their heart and soul into it. So what is it about Mothman that triggered that in you?
honestly, for me, it was speaking with the witnesses.
Mm.
The reason that I do this is that I know what it's like to experience the impossible, and I know how isolating that can be, and I know how difficult it can be when you feel like nobody's going to believe you. And so, what keeps me interested in not just Mothman, but every paranormal phenomena that I investigate is being able to help people as much as I can. Just hear them
Oh,
out,
that's
and
nice.
just do my absolute best to authentically relate their experience, using their own words as much as possible, but just to really do it in good faith. So then other people out there, maybe little kids who just like me are being introduced to this subject because they have their own experiences that are going on in their lives, can read these stories and go, wow, somebody else has experienced this. I'm not alone, and that's what keeps me going. That's why.
Have you researched your own experiences? Like the thing with the hands, I don't think I've ever heard, and I interviewed so many people where they've felt hands like trying to lift them up, and you mentioned it almost sounded lizard like in the skin texture. Like, have you done any research into your own experiences, like with maybe that was a cryptid type being that was visiting you, or like I said before, it might have been an extraterrestrial, like, or have you just let these experiences kind of, you felt them and just let them pass through you? Like, did you go for hypnosis? I mean, what's that been like for you?
Sure. I've never done hypnosis or anything like that. I have spent significant time thinking about the things that have happened to me. And of course, I'm curious about them. And that's what got me into this, was reading stories, about other people's experiences, and seeing like commonalities, and the relative comfort I think that I felt as a result of that. And I spent a lot of time, of course, reading about unusual subjects and doing research and things. And I have encountered, maybe not exactly the same, but I've certainly encountered a lot of reported phenomena, especially within like alien abduction and UFOs and things,
Mhm.
that is fairly similar to what I experienced. And the reason is, when you really get into alien abduction, it is such a broader, more varied, just absolutely bonkers phenomenon than people
Oh,
think.
yeah.
Like people think of it as like what they've seen on TV or in movies, where like some gray
Mhm.
aliens just walk into your house and carry you away or whatever. But that, honestly, what people report, even the stuff that started that, you go and read like Whitley Strieber's stuff. It's
Yeah.
all so much weirder than that, and it all involves this connection to human consciousness, and all of this other weirdness. And so when I view it through that lens, then I'm like, okay, so I think it's most closely related to that, or it at least seems to resemble that the most, because when you really dig into the reports of people who have
Mhm.
experienced, sort of like the
Yeah.
abduction phenomenon, they will report a lot of those kinds of weird nighttime visitations, and they don't always make a ton of sense outside of any context. But then you add that context of their other experiences, and you're like, oh, okay, well, obviously, like something is visiting you. You know, we don't know what it is, but it's definitely something.
Yeah, and
And
I
so it
think
has
it's
that in common.
yeah, and I think it's important to ask, like, it's visiting you, but at what dimension? Because I interview dear friend Preston Dennett. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a prolific author and of UFO phenomenon, the whole thing. Anything high strangeness, Preston's been a great resource. And he's taught me a lot about astral projection. And one thing he said to me that really resonated, because he teaches you how to do it as well, carefully and whatnot. But he said, when you travel astrally, that he said, always walk over to like a wall or a table and try to tap it. See if your finger goes through it. Because if it doesn't, that means you're awake. And if it goes through, that means you're traveling. So I'm wondering in your case, if when you said you were wide awake in that one situation, maybe you were not awake. Maybe you were astral traveling and thought you were awake, because he said that you can't tell when you're awake and traveling.
Mhm.
So I'm just wondering, have you ever thought about that? Like,
No, I mean, I think that's interesting. I mean, I have considered sort of the parapsychological possibilities. I think, and because I had another experience where I seemed to be floating when I woke up, and so that
mm,
idea of like astral projection, of course, came in,
yes.
and um, in many of these situations, so like for instance, in the one that I related with those hands, I was interacting with the bed. Like there was physicality to that. Like it was a solid object that I was interacting with, and
Okay.
so I don't know. I mean, if I was astrally projecting, should I have gone through the covers? Should I have been able to touch the bed and have it feel solid?
Well,
I,
that's
I honestly
interesting.
don't know.
Yeah, according to Preston, you can often feel like you're in the real world and like walk on floors, and and
Hmm.
then in it you have like this moment where of clarity, where that's where he said use intention and try to like put your finger through a table, or say, can my finger go through, can I walk through this wall? Because he said there is confusion when you're traveling. Sometimes you think you're in the real world and you're not. I mean, I'm just kind of throwing that out there.
Well, it's an
um
interesting idea. Yeah,
yeah, it
no,
is.
absolutely.
It is interesting. So what are you working on now? What's happening with you? Are you still doing the Mothman research, or have you moved on to another cryptid or topic?
Sure. Well, my next book that I'm working on deals with high strangeness, and I really want to examine the connections between various phenomena. So, really examine things like UFOs, alien abductions, ghosts and hauntings,
Hmm.
cryptid sightings, all of that kind of stuff, and look at what they have in common, and look at what they don't have in common, and see what the connections are there. And as far as I can tell, I think the biggest connection is us, is humanity, is human consciousness, and
Yes.
how that interacts with all of these different things. So I have a feeling that's going to take up a fair chunk of what I'm talking about in this next book.
Yeah, you stated in your book too, and I kind of noted it. Um, to think of a four-dimensional entity, for instance, to them, humanity would be as a two-dimensional creature as to us. You go on to say this 4D being would be privy to an entire extra dimension through which it could interact with the universe. From a two-dimensional perspective, a three-dimensional being would be able to interact with their environment in ways that seem impossible. Maybe you could kind of
Yep.
just explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, we can start by imagining what it would be like to be a two-dimensional creature interacting with us, a three-dimensional being, right? So you've got this two-dimensional being that is basically, flat. It's
Yep.
got like length and breadth, but no width, right? And so here we are. We've got this whole extra dimension, and so we could, because we're three-dimensional, we could pop into and out of its perception in a way that would seem like magic. But to us, it's as simple as just entering its two-dimensional space and then leaving, which we can do at will. It's the easiest thing in the world for us to do. But that two-dimensional being is going to see this thing pop into its reality and pop back out, just vanishing seemingly impossibly.
Right.
And perhaps most disturbingly, it's not going to be able to see all of us. It's only going to be able to even view the portion of us that exists in the dimensions that it does, which really, I think, asks a lot of, like, forces us to ask some questions about what we're really interacting with, and if we're even capable of viewing the entirety of these phenomena, which is a very disturbing idea. But you
Hmm.
know, the evidence we have at this point, could allow for that as a possibility.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean the whole, field of high strangeness is full of of mystery and the unknown. And I mean, even if you look at like CERN, right, with the Large Hadron Collider, they're saying, and I read an article that they are able to manifest or come in contact with creatures from other dimensions or extra dimensional beings. Have you heard that about what they're doing over there?
I don't. I think I've certainly heard rumors, but I don't have any specific knowledge, and I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I don't know definitively, I guess, if that is taking place. But I mean, as far as I know, dozens of people a year are interacting with interdimensional or extra dimensional creatures because they reach out to me and tell me. So,
Yeah, it's just weird because when you look at CERN, like this article says, CERN researchers confirm the existence of the force. Physicists at a European laboratory for particle physics announced today that there's an invisible force that permeates the universe, binding the galaxy together. I mean, there's so much being discovered in the world of quantum physics and so on. And I think this directly ties into this world of high strangeness that so many of us are experiencing. And now science is kind of catching up to it. Does that make sense?
oh, totally. I mean, I think that the issue that we've had for years and years now is that we don't have any reliable technological means
Yeah.
to detect or record paranormal phenomena. The most valuable piece of equipment that we have, and the only thing that seems to be able to to reliably perceive or record paranormal phenomena, is the human mind. And we need something. We just need technology to catch up. And so, if that's happening, I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, and I think it is. And I think that's great that it is. And it doesn't seem so taboo anymore. Like you mentioned before, that witnesses don't want to come forward because the same thing with UFO witnesses, or people that have been abducted or taken or whatever verbiage you want to use. Because I know that the community doesn't like that word abducted. They use the word taken and so many different words. But
Sure.
I think it's less taboo nowadays to I mean, look at the internet. It's loaded with folks that are coming forward with different types of experiences in the arena of high strangeness, whether it's Bigfoot, cryptids, whatever. I mean, I think people aren't as um afraid to come forward because they're worried about their jobs. I think that it's more widely accepted. Have you been noticing that with people you're interviewing, or is everybody still skittish and worried about? I know you mentioned people don't want to come forward, but are they starting to like?
I think it depends. Now, I think it depends on the specific phenomenon. Things like ghosts and UFOs, and certain cryptids like Bigfoot, they've received a lot of mainstream attention,
Yes.
and so I think that people are far less reluctant to come forward about those kinds of subjects specifically. But if they think that nobody else has experienced the thing that they've experienced, then they are far less likely to come
Ah, that's a
forward
good
because
point.
they're worried that people are going to make fun of them. And so what happens is they'll see like an article I've written or a book or a TV appearance or something, and they'll go, "Wow, I had no idea that all of these other people were experiencing this. I got to get a hold of this guy," and that's when they will reach out to me because at
Yeah.
this point, who knows how many stories we've lost to time where people just
Oh,
spent their
sure.
whole life and never shared it.
Oh, I'm sure it could go back eons. The stuff that people have witnessed and never told us about. Has this affected your life in a positive way? Writing these books and being open about these types of topics. Have you had any
I think
negative
so.
effects?
Well, I haven't had any specific, I think, negative effects as a result of investigating any paranormal phenomena. Most
Yeah.
people are very positive. Most people in my normal life are very encouraging and supportive, even if they're not into the paranormal. Which I mean, most of my friends aren't. Most of my family isn't. It is what it is. They're still very supportive and wonderful about it. So no, I mean, I haven't experienced anything other than positivity, other than positivity, specifically because of investigating this stuff. Obviously, as a public figure, there's always a little bit of negativity that can come with that, but you just got to learn to laugh at it and move on.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think overall this has been a very positive experience, and I'm very blessed to have been able to work with and help as many people as I have.
That's awesome. So in closing, do you have anything else you want to say about Mothman or about your book or anything, that you're working on? Just take the floor and say whatever you need to.
Well, I would think that if there was one message I wanted to impart to anybody, it would be that if you've had an anomalous experience, don't be afraid to reach out and talk to somebody. It doesn't have to be me, but it can be. And if you'd like for me to investigate your experience, I would be more than happy to. And I'm more than happy to let you be anonymous if you're not comfortable publishing your name, because I understand that too. We all have sort of limits that we have to adhere to based on our own particular set of circumstances. So
Yeah.
if you are interested in anything that I'm up to or contacting me for any reason, you can always find me through my website, singularfortean.com. Just go to the contact page there. If you're interested in any of my books, of course, you can find those on the website as well. Or if you'd like to follow me on social media, just look for at Singular Tobias on Instagram, X, or Blue Sky, or you can just find me under my normal name on Facebook. I do have two profiles on there. I have my family one, and then I have my author one. So you're going to want to look for that author one. But you can always reach out to me through there too.
So you would be willing to talk to anybody about any type of sighting, not just
Correct.
Mothman. It could be any type of extraterrestrial cryptids,
Yeah.
anything that's like anomalous, right?
Absolutely. I do not specialize in any particular area. I am interested in all types of paranormal phenomena, from ghosts and hauntings to cryptids to UFOs to alien abduction to even weirder stuff. I've received reports of time slips and phantom music and
Oh,
all manner of just truly bizarre subjects.
oh, I love that. Is it so your next book's going to cover more of that type of thing, right?
Definitely more. it's going to be much broader in scope. It's going to cover a variety of phenomena rather than just narrowing in and sort of focusing on Mothman like this last book did.
And what's the projected publication date for that?
Great question. This is very, very early stages. So I really have to go to the publisher with it and everything and see what their timeline is. I mean, I would anticipate maybe 2027, but do not quote me on that because I really don't know at this point.
And Mothman, this book, is it out, or you have a date coming for release of this book as well, correct?
September 8th. Yeah. So you can pre-order it now through whatever book service you like, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, whatever. Or it'll be out fully on September 8th.
Yeah, it was an excellent read. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I recommend it highly to anybody that's into, this type of cryptid universe. It really is nice. It's a page turner for sure. Like once I started reading, I couldn't put it down. So I highly recommend it. And again, I'll have all the links to where folks can find you, Tobias. Thank you so much for joining us. It was fascinating conversation, and it really cleared up a lot of confusion about Mothman for me. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. This was a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. And I will be in touch with you again. And of course, when your next book comes out, we'll have to do this again.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tobias. I'll be in touch soon.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Well, that was really a riveting conversation. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed this, Tobias. Thank you. And again, your book, Mothman, Sightings and Investigations of the Iconic Flying Cryptid, truly offers a fresh and compelling perspective on this whole phenomenon that seems to continue to intrigue and perplex us. And he did give us a lot of good ideas as to where this phenomenon could be coming from. And I love the depth of his research and the dedication that he used in exploring these lesser known modern sightings. And it's a must read for anybody that enjoys reading about cryptids and the unexplained. So thank you again, Tobias, for joining us today. And thank you all for tuning in. And again, you've been listening to Ethereal Encounters Unveiled. And of course, that is our YouTube channel. But we are always airing twice a week. And you'll find us on the United Public Radio Network and the UFO Paranormal Radio Network, which is 105.3 on the Gulf Coast and 107.7 FM in New Orleans. Please be sure and support all of our other hosts on this network. We cover topics ranging from ancient history, ufology, the paranormal, extraterrestrial theories, conspiracy theories, cryptozoology, ancient history, metaphysics, you name it, we cover it. A lot of history and world mysteries as well. Anything that falls under the umbrella of high strangeness. So thank you all so much again for joining us. And you will find us live on the United Public Radio Network and the UFO Paranormal Radio Network every Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And of course, we air on Friday, which is our pre-recordings at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So thank you all so much. God bless. Take care. Have a wonderful one.